Well, good morning, everyone. I'm really excited this morning because this morning we have two wonderful speakers and their backgrounds will take us a whole session to be able to describe both of their wonderful backgrounds. And we have Associate Professor Rob Nicholls and Professor Pamela Hanrahan, and they bring a completely different discipline to us as well today, looking at more business studies and looking at legal and regulation issues. And they come from a wealth of experience in industry as well as broad disciplinary expertise. And it's going to be a shared talk today. So I'm going to, without further ado, pass it over to both Rob and Pamela. And I would ask people that as we go along, if you've got questions to ask, to pop them in the Q&A. And at the end, we will ask both our speakers those questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica, and good morning, everyone. Well done for being up and about at 9 a.m. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm on Gadigal country here in Sydney and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So we're going to give you a slightly different perspective on issues of cybersecurity and cyber resilience today, because as Monica mentioned, we come from a legal and regulatory background. So I was a corporations and financial services regulator, amongst other things, and a solicitor. And Rob will tell you a little bit about his background, but he's more on the telco and media side and an engineer by background. So we're very interested in how the community and the government seeks to incentivize or require private entities to take more and more effective steps to achieve cyber resilience. So we're going to speak for about 25 minutes and then leave plenty of time for questions. You can ask anything you want because we're conscious that this is not a legal audience. So we're very happy. No question is out of scope. So you can ask us anything that you want about what's going on at the moment. All right, now Rob's going to work the slides, so I'll ask Rob to click over to the next slide. So this is just a slide, backwards. This is just a slide that explains the context for our remarks today. And you'll say, well, all of those things are obvious, but they are hopefully going in the right direction. The first obvious observation is that Australian business is vulnerable to cyber attack from both state and non-state actors. And that's true in very large business, but as we've seen in the media over the last week or so, in small business as well. Cyber attack hurts business and its direct stakeholders. So boards and senior management care about cyber attacks because they impact the bottom line. So they're bad for shareholders, they're bad for customers, they're bad for suppliers and so on. But what we've increasingly seen over the last 5 years or so is a recognition that cyber attack on private business imperils national security as well. And so you'll see that the government is starting to spread its response to take account not only of the impact of cyber attack on business and its direct stakeholders, but also this national security piece. So what we're seeing at the moment is a very immature regulatory structure where we have lots of different regulatory agencies and lots of different pieces of legislation trying different strategies to put the onus on corporations and their senior managers to build and demonstrate greater cyber resilience. So we've got a bit of a, if you imagine a shotgun with lots of pellets firing out at the end with some people in suits standing at the far end of the firing range, that's where we're at the moment. And that includes a range of what we in our discipline describe as hard and soft law frameworks. So hard law frameworks are legislation and legislative instruments that have punishments attached to the breach of them. Soft law frameworks are regulatory arrangements which are more consensual in character, so voluntary codes of conduct, reporting frameworks and the like. So we're seeing a mixture of tools being used here. And added to that mix is a piece of legislation that I'll talk about in a moment. Thanks, Rob. He may be moving me along quickly because he wants to leave plenty of time for his bit. So, these are the two issues that we ponder. The first is if we accept that greater cyber resilience in private business is good, not only for business and its stakeholders, but also for national security, how do you best achieve that? And I'm not talking about achieving that through technical or behavioural means, although as we'll come back to later, I think those things need to be better integrated into law. But can you, I've said scare, can you incentivise, can you encourage, can you deter, can you scare boards and management of entities into solving for cyber resilience? So can you pass a piece of legislation that says to an organisation, if you're the victim of a sophisticated cyber attack from a state actor, then we'll fine you $500 million, and that will incentivise them not to be attacked. So to put it another way, is traditional regulation an effective tool for encouraging the outcome that we all want? That's the primary question. The secondary question that arises out of what I said about the shotgun is, we've got lots of regulators and lots of regulatory agencies muddling around in this space. And it's a feature of regulatory design that different regulators use different ways of achieving the outcomes that they want. And so from our technical perspective, there are some issues emerging about lack of coordination, both between regulators who all want to be active in this space, because as you all know, this is a very exciting and groovy space, so they all want to be playing in this. Are they understanding each other, and are they understanding the things that are actually driving or constraining business in responding in building its cyber resilience? Thanks, Rob. So there are two sectors in the economy at the moment where there is significant hard law and soft law intervention for cyber resilience. One is the financial sector, the other is telcos. So I'll speak to the financial sector just really briefly, and then Rob will talk about telcos. The first thing to note, and I'm happy for you to ask me about this later, is that our corporations law in Australia, our Companies Act, imposes duties, including a duty of care on directors and officers of companies that can be enforced by the state. So it's enforced by the securities regulator. This is actually quite unusual. Usually negligence duties in other jurisdictions only sound in a private remedy for shareholders or for the company if it's harmed by negligence, but we actually have a public negligence duty in our corporations law, and it is a duty to exercise care to avoid the foreseeable risk of harm to the company that will result from breaking the law, for example, from being the victim of a preventable cyber attack. So we already have public law that encourages or incentivises directors and senior managers to care about their compliance systems and their risk management frameworks. We also have from the securities regulator a very significant emphasis on regulating for cyber resilience, which we can talk about in the question session. For financial institutions individually, they are subject to prudential supervision by APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, and it has 4 supervision priorities for this year, and one of them is cyber resilience. So you can see it's very important there. And then we have a range of soft law like industry codes, frameworks, best practice for listed companies, the Corporate Governance Council, principles for good governance, and so on. Rob, I'll let you talk about telco. Rob, you're on mute.
Thanks. Oh dear, how terrible. So Pamela's looked at financial services. I'm going to look at telco, but I'm also going to drift into broadcasting a little bit as well. Now, one of the issues in the telecommunications sector is the existence of current legislation and regulations, which reflect a current understanding of the national security implications of telecommunications systems. The Telecommunications Sector Security Reforms, or TSSR, were introduced 3 years ago in order to minimise the national security risk associated with the operation of telco networks. Part of the obligations under the TSSR are to ensure that data is held onshore in Australia. Effectively, there was a concern by security agencies and law enforcement agencies that telecommunications metadata might be held in a place which was inaccessible in the event that a relevant warrant or request was served. Ironically, the problem that was identified was not because data was stored in data centers in China or North Korea. It was actually that metadata stored in the US, in this case, in relation to low Earth orbit satellite-based services, that highlighted the issue. Even then, the problem wasn't to do with national security, but actually drug enforcement. In particular, where drug running was operated by freighter ships and where the relevant organizer used a sat phone to arrange for the cargo to be collected. The effects of the change have been quite significant. The telecommunications industry required a very significant subsidy from the Commonwealth Government to make the changes from identified country-hosted clouds to Australian-hosted clouds. At the same time, the industry took the opportunity to improve its disaster recovery management plans by ensuring that there was a reasonable amount of duplication of data storage infrastructure. Overall, the Commonwealth directed a change in operational practice, but was prepared to pay, well, at least a majority of the cost of that change. So telecommunications is also slightly different because there's a specific obligation on telecommunications carriers to use reasonable assistance to prevent their networks from being used for an offence. That offence might include something that affects the national purse as well as national security. And in practice, it means there's an obligation on telcos to provide metadata and location-based information associated with communications in respect only to a request. You only need a warrant if you actually need to look at the content. Now, I've mentioned broadcasting because it's a bit more complicated and raises some of the issues that you see in looking at critical infrastructure. So broadcasting is a Commonwealth matter under the Constitution, and the consequences are that the legislation is all at that level. However, the need to provide emergency service broadcasts is driven by local emergency services. These are necessarily at the state level. And as a result, there's an obligation under the Broadcasting Services Act, Commonwealth legislation, for commercial television and radio broadcasters to deliver information from state police and state fire services in the event of an emergency. However, if there's a national emergency, such as the threat to the broadcasting infrastructure itself, it's not clear that an emergency service exists at the Commonwealth level from the legislation. In effect, critical infrastructure can be used by the states, but national security might not be an emergency. These are some of the issues that sort of affect these sectors looking at critical infrastructure. I'll hand over to Pamela to talk about the bill.
Now, legislation. So there is a piece of legislation that's currently being reviewed and debated in Canberra, which is a very significant step change in our approach to trying to incentivise or encourage greater cyber resilience in private industry with a national security rather than a stakeholder focus. And it's called the Security Legislation Amendment Critical Infrastructure Close Bracket Bill of 2020. It was introduced into the House, I think, in December of 2020 and went straight to a parliamentary committee. Now, this is the process by which controversial legislation or complex legislation is often dealt with in Canberra. So they refer it to a parliamentary committee who then asks various people who are interested to make submissions on whether the legislation in its draft form is going to achieve the government's policy outcome. Often well, if I'm the author of the submission, we might also comment on whether the policy outcome is one that's worth achieving. But I think they're always more interested in whether the legislation is effective to achieve the outcome that they want. Now, this is a really significant piece of legislation for three reasons. The first, and I'll talk about this in a moment, is that it expands the categories of business in Australia that are treated as critical infrastructure, and it expands those sectors from 4 to 11. I'll come back to that. The second is that it imposes new obligations on businesses to take positive steps towards cyber resilience. And the third reason why it's significant is that if a business is subject to a cyber attack which has national security implications, it gives the government rights to step in or intervene and take over the management of that incident. So these are three very significant issues, particularly for lawyers who tend to worry about issues like, individual rights and freedoms and so on. So next slide, Rob. This slide I shamelessly took from the Herbert Smith Freehills website, so I acknowledge with gratitude this excellent slide, but it represents what the new legislation will do. All critical infrastructure assets are subject to directions and direct action in connection with specific threats. Then there's regulated critical infrastructure assets, which is a smaller subset. They're subject to the positive security obligations that I talked about a moment ago. So they have, rather than a sort of negative, don't be negligent type test, it's a positive test that you have to put in place arrangements. And the other thing that's causing significant concern, I suppose, amongst businesses affected by this is that there's an obligation to report incidents on a very short time frame. So there'll be a compliance burden attached with this legislation, but if you're a listed entity, it also has implications about when information is released to the market on very short time frames. Often entities don't have all the information that they need to explain to the market the impact of the potential breach and so on. So there's issues around that reporting obligation. And then for systems of national significance, there are enhanced security obligations, including wargaming and so on. Rob, thanks. So I said a moment ago that this is significant because it's greatly expanded the categories of what are referred to as critical infrastructure, and therefore, I suppose, thought of by government as something in which it ought to have the right to, I was going to say meddle, I won't say meddle, intervene. Previously, we only thought about critical infrastructure as water, electricity, gas and ports, and they were always subject to reporting obligations around cybersecurity risk. But as you can see from this little set of tiles, that is significantly expanded. And you'll see I put us in the middle. Higher education and research is considered a critical infrastructure, part of Australia's critical infrastructure, and therefore all the things that I've talked about, including being the subject of a cyber attack, allowing the government agency to step in and assume control of that, that could happen to UNSW because we would be classified as critical infrastructure, along with more obvious ones, I guess, like defence and space, but perhaps less intuitively obvious ones like food and grocery. Rob.
Okay, so Pamela's described this new legislation and it raises two key questions for me. Well, the first is the logical one, will it improve national security? And the second one comes to this right of intervention or a step-in right. Would it actually work if it was required? I think this is important to get the context because the ACSC report that came out last week said that a quarter of reported cybersecurity incidents affected entities associated with the existing much narrower scope of critical infrastructure. So the big so what question is whether the extension of the scope of critical infrastructure will actually improve national security. I think here what we need to do is look at the effects of the proposed legislation from the perspective of business. Of course, the first thing that a newly effective business will do is to work out how to comply. The answer, not surprisingly, is to build the cheapest compliance solution that will meet the obligations set out in the rules. But there are a couple of problems here. The first is that the rules are written based on an assumption as to the structure of the industry, and the primary assumption there is homogeneity. That is, there's an assumption that there is one big business operating all aspects of the infrastructure. In practice, this is highly unlikely to be the case. Supply chains in most businesses are complex. In those businesses which operate critical infrastructure, they're the most complex. Aspects of almost every part of the business are either contracted out, outsourced, or offshored. Excuse me. And this means that the compliance solution has to be used by all of these contractors, outsourced providers, or offshore businesses. Now, that means that an effective solution, or at least an effective solution from a compliance perspective, is going to look like a check-the-box compliance solution rather than anything else. Unlike the telecommunications examples I gave earlier, where there was direct government support at a Commonwealth level, in this case, there's merely a step-in right given to the Commonwealth. In my view, this creates moral hazard. Effectively, if there is a critical infrastructure compromise, the critical infrastructure operator can put their hands in the air and say, "Commonwealth, rescue me." Now, I was in a bit of a dilemma in trying to work out how to illustrate this next point. In the end, I chose the IGA at Ainslie. I had the option of choosing the IGA on the Kensington campus. I don't know the managers of either of these stores. I do know that they have an agreement which looks a bit like a franchise agreement to operate the IGA. They operate it on behalf of themselves as businesses, but part of the Metcash supply chain. My guess is that neither of the IGA managers has had training in critical infrastructure. Yet each of these stores will be critical infrastructure under the legislation. Metcash would be acting perfectly reasonably by using a check-the-box compliance systems for these stores. However, my contention is that this wouldn't achieve the results that are expected from the legislation from a national security perspective. I think there's also an issue with the other side of the moral hazard. That is, there is a great capability in logistics available in defence at a Commonwealth level. However, most of the industries that have critical infrastructure are not logistics based. For example, there's no history of success operating a metropolitan water system at a Commonwealth level. To be fair, there's no reason why there should be. Actually, it's somewhat worse. The only Commonwealth experience in operating a water system is the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. In my view, this could hardly be described as a great success story. It extends further. Wherever the Commonwealth has held Commonwealth-controlled infrastructure in the past, with the exception of the Snowy Hydro scheme, that corporate memory has been lost. There is no Commonwealth experience of operating a commercial cellular telecommunications system. There's no Commonwealth experience of operating an electricity distribution system. There are national security risks, and I'm going to give you an example of how the assumption of operation of critical infrastructure at a Commonwealth level can increase those risks rather than decrease them. It comes from telecommunications and the TSSR I mentioned earlier. So major telco providers in Australia outsource part of their network operations to major vendors. These include vendors such as Nokia and Ericsson. In order to be able to make reasonable margins out of these outsourced contracts, Nokia and Ericsson use offshore resources. However, the outsourced providers understand the regulatory requirements imposed on and by the carriers. As a consequence, in India and the Philippines, the customer or network support personnel don't have access to local databases which contain telecommunications data. Instead, those personnel have access to Australian-based systems and use virtualization. Basically, they can see a picture of a screen in Australia and can manage network functions through that picture. In many cases, there are different physical locations in the offshore location with different level of security within a network operations center, and that might be in a city such as Chennai. In normal times, this works very well. That is, there's a low-cost, compliant solution. But as a result of the pandemic, the network operations centers in places like Chennai and Cebu were closed. The work from home solutions, for example, in India, were hampered by the availability of wireless broadband. In general, wireless broadband is great in India. However, when all of the outsourced workers for all of the telco networks around the world suddenly create demand on the retail residential Indian cellular networks, there's a problem. And that problem can't be immediately solved in Australia because the relevant skills are now offshore. So in this example, the availability of an Australian network, which is part of the critical infrastructure that ensures national security, was put at risk by the network loads on an Indian cellular communications network. I know this is a bit of an extreme example, but I think it highlights the unintended potential risks that flow from regulation on critical infrastructure in the case that homogeneity is assumed. I'll hand over to Pamela for a cautionary tale.
Thanks, Rob. I was reflecting while you were speaking about the fact that complying with this new law will probably lead to greater concentration in some of those critical infrastructure sectors. It will be more difficult to be a small Australian offshoot of a big global firm because of the kind of compliance build and expense that'll be attached to the Australian arrangements. And anything that produces more concentration in the system produces more risk. So we might come back to that in the Q&A. I've put this slide up here not to make an example of AUSTRAC as a bad regulator. I'm not trying to do that, but I just wanted to point out the parallels between the critical infrastructure bill and the arrangements that we have for anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing in Australia and around the world. So over the last 15 years or so, all around the world, governments have sought to prevent the use of financial systems to facilitate crime and terrorism by imposing on private entities, banks and other people who handle money, obligations to report when they identify anomalous transactions in their system. And so this is supposed to be an example of government and the private sector cooperating to a common end, which is to prevent the use of the financial system to enable crime. What we've seen over the last decade or so is that it's one thing to legislate for this, but making it work is incredibly complicated. And if you reflect on the stories that you've seen in the news over the last couple of years, Westpac being fined $1.3 billion for breaching the money laundering laws. We've also had, I think, $700 million fine for another bank. I think it might have been CBA. The gaming system, the gambling system, is also very vulnerable to money laundering, and we had a very significant fine against the TAB some time ago. So what we've tended to see is legislation which starts from the same point of view as the one we're talking about, which is let's enlist the help of the private sector to put in place arrangements that prevent these criminals infiltrating our systems. But the perception amongst people here and abroad, so it's the same problem in the UK, in Europe, in the US, is that the systems themselves are incredibly expensive to create, and they often don't work. So we know that AUSTRAC, as the regulator, has recently examined the compliance of all of the major financial institutions in Australia and has found that none of them is adequately complying. So that suggests to me that simply passing a piece of legislation, wishing that people will do something which is difficult, doesn't get us all the way there. And so what Rob and I are really interested in and want to talk to you about and get your thoughts on is, how do we design a regulatory or a control system that avoids the problem that we've had with this system and works better? Rob.
Okay, so we think that there's a solution, or at least a way forward. So in our view, one of the critical issues is to ensure that we align the regulation and governance to the required outcomes rather than expected outputs. So this type of outcomes-oriented analysis is common in regulatory governance. It's also used in negotiation and dispute resolution theory. Focus on outcomes and interests rather than positions. Improved national security and increased cyber resilience have a mutual interest and the same outcomes. They might have entirely distinct outputs. Once you take that step and recognize the commonality between, commonality between critical infrastructure sectors needs to be outcomes focused, and you can use that as the basis for collaboration. However, it does require an understanding from both sides as to the exogenous constraints, such as a complex regulatory and governance regime, which characterize each of the distinct critical infrastructure sectors. There's an old regulatory adage: you can't manage what you can't measure. And this means that the development and dissemination of evidence-based measures of cyber resilience is important. It also means agility and adaptability in how you apply that measurement. Okay, well, thanks very much for listening. We're really looking forward to questions. I can see there's a couple in the Q&A, but I can't see what they are at the moment.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. We very much enjoyed it here.